Hello, everybody. LC Holt here, and this is my update for the week of July the 20th. Rebecca Ivey joining me once again. Rebecca, I got to ask you a question.
Yes.
When you first met me,
Yeah.
who was one of my favorite actors of all time?
See, you're asking me this, and I just got through telling someone about this because they asked me what the show was about today, and they said, well, they were just asking, oh, what made you pick that topic? And I just said, Elsie was obsessed with Psycho and Anthony Perkins when I first met him. Maybe obsessed is a little strong, but you were really into it. And I started naming off other things you were really into when we first met.
Yeah,
and I was like, oh yeah, he was into this. Anthony Perkins, Psycho.
Yeah, I was such a tremendous admirer.
Yeah.
I was such a tremendous admirer of Anthony Perkins as an actor, and the film Psycho as a film. Primarily, I think because I'll tell you one of the first. I remember. Do you remember back when we were kids, before there was internet and everything? The way you found out about a movie, if it was playing or not, you would open the newspaper, and there would be these little ads in there, and the ad would give like the poster of the film, and then you see the show times beneath. I have a very, very vivid memory of being in a car driving toward a neighboring town where I lived when I was a kid, and opening the newspaper that my parents had in the seat of the car, and seeing the black and white poster for Psycho 3, which had Anthony Perkins holding the key for the room out toward the audience and giving the show times. And I remember just being taken by that and thinking, what is this? That's so interesting. It was something about that image of that poster, which is still a great poster, regardless of time. But that just stuck with me, so much so that I have so vivid a memory. And then, later in life, not that much later, I'd seen, I think the third Psycho was the first one I saw on VHS. And then I sort of watched backwards and was so completely enamored, not just by the story, but by the acting of Anthony Perkins, who I still think is tremendously underrated. He was a fantastic actor for many years prior to doing Psycho in 1960.
I was going to say, growing up, one of the movies that was shown a lot in my house, my mother had seen Psycho. She never really would watch it in the house because she said she remember when she saw it just scared the crap out of her. So she was always like, it kind of creeped her out. But her and my dad, several times, Friendly Persuasions, they would always play that one. If it was on, that movie was going to be played on our TV that night.
Well, it's great that you mentioned that because, I was about to say that Perkins was nominated for an Academy Award, and it was for that movie, Friendly Persuasions, in which he played a young Quaker teenager who goes to war. He's the son of Gary Cooper in that movie. And I remember seeing an interview with Perkins when he was an older man, and someone was asking him about the time, working with Gary Cooper and everything. And he said when he met Gary Cooper, he was just always like, well, when you were young, talking to Cooper, well, when you were young, what was it like this and what was it like that? And because Perkins was only in his 20s, and Anthony Perkins said that Gary Cooper told him, all right, kid, you got to stop with all this young crap. that was one of his earliest memories of being an actor in a major movie with Gary Cooper. But yes, Anthony Perkins was nominated for an Academy Award for Friendly Persuasions and lost to another Anthony Quinn, but was certainly nominated. He was meant to be he was a contemporary of James Dean, but he was also meant to almost be like a successor to Dean, because he had that same sort of moody leading man intensity in movies like Fear Strikes Out. He did a comedy called The Tall Story. There was a number of 10 Star was another movie he did, which was a Western.
So Green Mansions.
Yes. He was one of those guys that was poised to be a major leading man. And I guess that sort of winds us around back into the story of Psycho, which, for the two of you who don't know, Psycho is based on a 1959 novel by Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch, having lived about 40 miles from the home of Ed Gein in Wisconsin, was very well aware of the murders that took place on the Gein farm and all the subsequent trials and everything that were brought to that area of Wisconsin, which was very quiet and laconic. It was not the kind of place that this sort of thing happened. And basically, in a nutshell, if you want to hear more about Ed Gein, you can go back and watch the show that you and I and CW did.
Are you going to link it in the?
Yeah, I can certainly do that, because it is a very interesting case of a man who became so obsessed with his mother that after she died, he sealed off the parts of the house she lived in, walked around in her clothing, and sort of tried to invent this fantasy world in which his mother was still alive and living with him. And he wound up murdering a bunch of people. And the people, more times than not, were older women who reminded him in some which way of his own mother. So that's Ed Gein in a nutshell. And that's what inspired Robert Bloch to write Psycho. Now, Paramount Pictures, as they often did, went through many, many books looking for material in which they could maybe make into a film. They read Psycho prior to Alfred Hitchcock ever coming into the story and said, this is a sleazy paperback this is not worth making a film of. They really considered it to be D-rate material. So they passed altogether. Well, when the book was passed to Hitchcock, who at this time was an enormously successful director who did major high-budget motion pictures, not the kind of guy you would think would be interested in what the studio called a sleazy paperback. He saw something in the novel that he loved, and he bought the rights. It was like $9,000, almost $10,000 he paid for the rights personally. And he tried to get Paramount interested in doing it. And they were like, well, we read the book and it's sleazy. We have no interest in doing it. But there's that movie you were supposed to be doing for us with Audrey Hepburn. He was going to do a movie called No Bail for the Judge that starred Audrey Hepburn. She had gotten pregnant and couldn't do it. And so Hitchcock kind of was looking for another project. And for some reason, he became really, really obsessed with making Psycho into a film, even though nobody, including his parent studio, wanted to do it. He eventually got them to agree to distribute the movie if he personally financed it. So Hitchcock saw so much promise in this that he was willing to put up all the money for the production himself. He dropped his own director's fee, which at that time was $250,000. So he wasn't going to get paid as a director at all. And since he was financing the movie, the deal was Paramount would distribute it and he would keep like 60% ownership of the film. And the way that he thought he would do this is to do it low budget. $1 million, less than $1 million actually, he put up of his own money to make the movie, which was kind of unheard of for a director. It would be like Steven Spielberg nowadays saying, I'm going to make a low-budget indie picture for $250,000.
Now, I heard that he basically everyone thought he was just filming an episode for his TV show.
Yeah, and probably the reason that they thought that is because he used all the crew and the studios, everything from Alfred Hitchcock Presents. That's what he used to film Psycho. So all of the sets were built on those stages. The cinematographer, the costume designer, all of the grips and the crew were from Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And that was another kind of cost-saving measure. The first guy who wrote Psycho as a screenplay was one of the writers on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, a guy named James Cavanaugh. But Hitchcock did not like his version of the script for the very reason that he felt it was just like a feature-length TV episode. Mm-hmm. He said he thought it was slow, and he did not enjoy that particular rendition of the novel. So he had some meetings with other screenwriters, amongst them being a guy who had only written one movie prior, a guy named Joseph Stefano. He came in, had a one-on-one meeting with Hitchcock, and Hitchcock must have saw something in Stefano because he hired him to write a new version of Psycho as a screenplay. Stefano wanted to follow the book as closely as he could, but there were some big changes that were made from the book in the screenplay. And we can talk about some of those. I'll throw them out there. One of the chief changes was Norman Bates himself, who in the book was overweight. He was middle-aged. He had kind of big glasses. He was an alcoholic, and he was far less outwardly innocent and charming. You kind of got a hint that he was a little kooky, from the giddy up. And in the book, Norman turns into Mother when he's in a drunken stupor. And this was changed radically for the film, in which Norman Bates turns into his mother persona when he becomes sexually aroused by a woman. And that triggers the jealous mother, which we can go into the psychology of this, the brilliant psychology of Norman Bates, which is, I think, what makes the character so endearing. And it's also what makes the movie so fascinating, Another huge thing was in the book, it's Norman's story. From the very first page, it's about Norman Bates. And I don't know if it was Hitchcock or Stefano or a combination of the two, but between them, what they decided was it would be more dramatically interesting for a film to do something that up until that time had never really been done before. And this, to me, sounds like a Hitchcock idea, personally. He said that let's make the female character who comes to the motel, let's start with her as the main character. And we'll follow her entirely for the first 40 minutes of the movie. And you'll think this is Marion Crane's story. And then we're going to kill her. And when we kill her, then it will become Norman Bates's story. And Hitchcock had this sort of, like I said, a brilliant narrative idea. So that was implemented in the screenplay. Also in the screenplay, the famous shower scene, which we'll talk about more here shortly. How could you do a show on Psycho without talking about that? In the book, she got beheaded. I think the line is something like, when he finds her in the shower, it says the knife cut off her scream and then her head, is how it's described. And they changed some other things. They were pretty innovative for their time in terms of their use of toilets. Because up until that point, American television and movies never showed toilets and certainly never showed a toilet flushing. How dare you, for shame. This is the first movie where you actually see a toilet flushing. And it seems like Hitchcock was adamant about doing that because in the book, the way that they know Marion was there when the sister and the boyfriend come to the motel is they find an earring that Norman forgot to clean up in the bathroom. Well, in the script and in the movie, it's a scrap of paper that didn't get flushed down the toilet. When she was making calculations, she tore up the piece of paper, put it in the toilet, and flushed it. First time you ever saw a toilet flush in American cinema. And then later in the movie, they find a scrap of paper that didn't get flushed down, and that's how they know that it was Marion. Marion was there. And there was also stuff like Norman in the book was a lot more sleazy and more forthcoming about his pornography addiction. This was made a real undercurrent in the movie, which, of course, Hitchcock is kind of good about that. Hitchcock's films always dealt with those sorts of wild sexual ideas, weird psychology in such a way that it was there, but it was sort of craftily put in. And part of it, of course, had to do with the censorship of the time. You couldn't just come right out and say, it was like when we were talking about the James Bond movie, where, Pussy Galore was in the book a lesbian. And then in the movie, they kind of had to be crafty. She still is, apparently, but you couldn't really say it because of the more quote-unquote morality of the time and the censors, which were killer at this particular juncture, 1960, especially in America. And also Marion's boyfriend, Sam Loomis, and Lila, who is Marion's sister, they team up in both the book and the movie to find out what happened to their sister and lover, respectively. And in the book, they kind of developed their own relationship. And I guess Hitchcock was thinking, let's not have them develop a relationship because it makes Sam look kind of sleazy that he was just with this woman that he loved and now he's off with her sister. That seems a little... So they kind of downplayed that. They're just sort of teaming up to find out what happened to Marion in the movie. Speaking of Marion, the actress that Hitchcock chose play the character was his very first choice was Janet Leigh, and that's who he got. Janet Leigh was a big bankable star, and this played into his whole idea about killing the lead character and making that so shocking, 40 minutes into the movie, because Janet Leigh at the time was a huge bankable star. In fact, she took a major cut in pay to be in this movie just to work with Hitchcock. And so that was part of his plan, to kill a big, like, America's Sweetheart type movie star. And like we were talking about before, Anthony Perkins was already quite well established with his Academy Award nominations and such. And so Hitchcock sort of decided to put those two actors together. In fact, Norman Bates as a character in the script was fashioned around Anthony Perkins. They thought, Hitchcock was like, let's make him an Anthony Perkins type. And so when it came time to cast, well, who do you cast as an Anthony Perkins type? You get, Anthony Perkins himself. It's kind of funny, though. The guy who plays Sam Loomis is an actor named John Gavin, who would later go on to be one of the front runners to replace Sean Connery as James Bond. Ironically enough, though, at this point in time, Hitchcock was not pleased with John Gavin's performance. He used to call him the Stiff. At one point, they even had to reshoot the opening love scene with Marion and Sam because Hitchcock was like, there's no passion here. And he blamed it on the Stiff, who that's what he called John Gavin. I guess John Gavin's just like he didn't get fired from the sounds of it. Hitchcock sounded like he was not a big fan of his performance. But like I said, they shot it 1959 into 1960, same stages as Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Bates Motel was built on the back lot, as well as the House on the Hill. The House on the Hill is based on Edward Hopper, who, as you know, I'm a huge Edward Hopper fan. I think he's one of my favorite painters of all time, amongst others. But he has a painting called The House by the Railroad. And if you look at that painting, it's very similar to the Bates house, what would later become the Bates house. And so that was sort of the inspiration. The interior sets were all done on sound stages. So the house and the motel were all just facades. The motel, the office, and the parlor were actually on in the set there. You could go in there, but all the rooms in both the Bates house and in the motel were not actually inside that facade. It's interesting. They opened the film in Phoenix, Arizona. And there's Hitchcock, again, trying to be as innovative as possible. He always was. He wanted the opening shot to be a helicopter shot that went all the way over the city of Phoenix and went through the motel window and up on the bed with Sam and Marion. Unfortunately, at this particular point in time, that sort of shot was not really possible. They tried to do it with a helicopter. It was way too shaky for Hitchcock's liking. So they couldn't do that. So it just happens in a series of pans and dissolves in the film. They did the shot the way Hitchcock originally envisioned it in the 1998 remake that Gus Van Sant did of Psycho, which that's a whole other story. I'm glad they finally did the Hitchcock opening shot, but yeah, I don't know how much further we should go into that. I will say I was one of the first in lines to see the remake because, again, huge Psycho fan. But, yeah, it's one of the few movies I was laughing by the end of it.
Yeah, he was just wrong for that part. He's just...
Vince Vaughn.
For me, yeah.
Yeah, Vince Vaughn was not great in the part. When he walks at the end and you reveal the mother thing and he's in his kimono with the blonde wig and he's coming toward Viggo Mortensen and he has the knife and he's coming at Viggo with like this come hither look. I mean, I laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. There was nothing scary about that. And it isn't just because Vince Vaughn is now a comedy actor. Because remember, at the time, Vince Vaughn did dramatic stuff too. He was not just like the Wedding Crashers guy. So, but watching that Psycho remake, you could say that was Vince Vaughn's first official comedy because it was a hilarious, very interesting experiment on the part of Vince Vaughn, or on the part of Gus Van Sant, the director. But so I have to give him that. But beyond that, I can't really say it was very successful. But anyway, let's go back to the original Psycho, the real Psycho. There were some things where Hitchcock, again, he was a perfectionist, technically especially. because there were scenes in the movie he wanted something very, very specific. The hotel room opening shot, obviously, he wasn't able to accomplish because of technical issues at the time, just made it impossible. The death of Arbogast, who is the Martin Balsam's character. He's coming up the stairs, and there's that great overhead shot where mother in quotes comes out of the bedroom and slashes his face, and then Arbogast falls down the stairs, which is always fun. In Psycho movies, I love the way people fall downstairs in all of these movies, because nobody rolls downstairs. They all just like this all the way down. They remain in a standing position. But a guy named Hilton Green directed that while Hitchcock was sick. And Hitchcock looked at the footage, didn't like it, because he said Balsam coming up the stairs, he looked sinister. And he said, the guy's got to look innocent, because the audience needs to feel something when he's murdered, that he doesn't need to be like creeping like a prowler. So Hitchcock, once he was well again, went back in and reshot all of that stuff. And, stuck Martin Balsam, the way they got that shot that I was just talking about, they stuck him on a rig where he basically sat in a seat with the camera in front of him, and they ran the rig down the stairs with Martin Balsam attached to it. And so that's not a special effect in terms of rear screen or anything. He's actually going down the stairs in a standing position. But of course, he's attached to a rig that the camera is also attached to. And it's just another way of Hitchcock getting a shot that he really wanted by thinking his way through it. And he was great with that. Like he did amazing special effects shots long before they were, could be easily accomplished even with opticals. He would just figure out some way of doing it. I can't remember the movie itself, but I remember there was a scene in one of his films where a plane is about to crash into water. And he had a camera on a small engine plane, and he shot, and the plane went down in a dive, shooting footage toward the water, and then at the last minute it pulled up. Well, they built a set with these huge water dunk tanks, and they put up a scrim that was like crepe paper. And the way they got the shot was he had the camera on the set behind the actors playing pilots, and sugar glass for the cockpit, and then this crepe paper, and then the dunk tanks behind it. And he projected the footage of the plane shot of going down toward the water, right, on the crepe paper. And so he was rolling the camera, and at this moment before the footage starts to pull up, right when it looks like we're about to hit the water, he hit a button, and it released all the water from these dunk tanks, which just shredded the crepe paper and just turned it into nothing. Came through the sugar glass and hit the actors. So that's how he got a shot of a plane crashing in real time in a car. I mean, it's just brilliant stuff that you just had to think up how to achieve it. And when you watch the movie, it's very effective. It looks like you're in a plane that's crashing into water, and you see it all go all the way underwater, with the water flooding into the cockpit. It's really fascinating. But he was doing that, before Psycho. He was doing it during, and he was doing it after, coming up with ways of getting the shots that he had in his mind executed, using basically just a multitude of old stage tricks. The shower scene, another great example of something he wanted to do that was very visceral, very affecting, and he achieved that 100%. It was a scene that had 77 camera angles, very short bit of actual screen time, and very unusual for the time in terms of how it was cut. Films at that point didn't have those quick cutty type montages. It was not really in the cinematic lexicon at that point, but Hitchcock sort of innovated yet again in trying to figure out a way of bringing the audience into the shower as if they were being attacked themselves by this mysterious figure. And there are a lot of myths about the shooting of that. I mean, one of the myths about the shooting was that, you could see knife at one point going into flesh, which is actually not true. Hitchcock was very adamant about not showing, but suggesting the stabbings. You do see knives against Flash and stuff like that for split seconds, but you never actually see the knife go in to Flash. One of the more popular myths about the shooting of that scene was that he had the water turn ice cold when Janet Leigh was attacked, which made her scream, which Janet Leigh herself said was completely false. It was not. The water was. She actually said they were very good about keeping her comfortable and everything during it. So, like is generally the case with these sorts of big moments in movies, a lot of mythology has grown up around how things were shot. And some people even said that Hitchcock didn't shoot it, that Saul Bass, the storyboard artist, shot it, which apparently is not true. Though Hitchcock did definitely use Bass's storyboards as a guide. They were very specific. And Hitch's wife, Alma, who was like his partner in crime, she read all the scripts. She helped with the movies. She watched the films through the editing process and gave him valuable notes. She helped with that too, because apparently in the first shot, the first time they shot Janet Leigh's face on the floor, you could see Janet Leigh's eye blink. And so they had to go back in and reshoot that wonderful shot where the camera turns out of Janet Leigh's eyeball where the pupil is not dilated, but we'll let that go. They had like contact lenses made that would make her pupil dilated as if she were dead. But apparently, back then they were made of glass, and it took like 6 weeks to acclimate to wearing them. And there was just no way in the time that they had to film the movie that she could acclimate to wearing this thing. So that's why her pupil is not dilated. But that aside, they did have a problem with Janet Leigh blinking at one point, which they had to go back in and reshoot, which very difficult because with that turn out of her eyeball and pulling back to a close shot of her face, all the focus on that had to be done manually back in those days. So it's very difficult to grab a shot like that. I mean, that's like a whole day's work is trying to get that shot coming out of her eyeball, But they managed to do it. I want to say, now this is something we have to talk about. What do you think of the music of Psycho?
Well, it's very iconic.
Isn't it, though? That's one of those things where I really think Psycho is one of those movies where the music is so much an integral part of the film itself. Bernard Herrmann, who had worked with Hitchcock before, he was about the only person on this shoot that didn't take a pay cut because Bernard got all his money too, but he deserved it. He certainly deserved it because that music is as much a part of the scenes as the actors. And
even today, when you do a fake knife stab, you do that.
Yes, you do that. The shower.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of strings on that score.
Yeah.
But used to great effect. And not just in the shower scene, but throughout as a sense of menace. I mean, really not a lot happens in Psycho in terms of action for the first 20 or 30 minutes of the movie. So that music and the tension it builds is so useful in that. I mean, it's amazing how the music itself, if you took, for instance, her packing her bags, Marion packing her bags to leave Phoenix, and you watched it without the music, it's a different experience. But when you throw that Bernard Herrmann score on that, it creates a sense of tension that is not there if you just look at the film itself, which is really saying something because Hitchcock was great at creating tension with the camera. But in this particular movie, that music, as I said before, is like it's like the blood of the film. It's the thing that keeps it going for so long, when essentially you're just watching a girl commit what is a petty crime. She's taking this money because she wants to get up with her boyfriend who's going through a divorce, and she thinks it's going to solve all their money woes. And of course, she's not thinking, she's not considering this because this is a terrible idea. And obviously she's going to get caught. She's a terrible criminal. And then she winds up at the Bates Motel, encounters Norman, and through a conversation with him decides that she's going to return the money and do the right thing. But she doesn't make it to that step because she has no idea what's going on with Norman. And I guess we could talk a little bit about what's going on with Norman, because he's got some major issues. Norman apparently lives with his mother, and they run this motel, but essentially he's running it because apparently she's an invalid. She's trapped up in her room there, and she's very protective of her son. And throughout the entire movie, you keep hearing from outside arguments going on between Norman and his mother up at the house. And if you've never seen the film before or any of the sequels, you have no reason to believe anything's going on there except for the fact that this boy's got a really possessive mother who likes to yell at him a lot. Until you get to the very end of the movie, in which it's revealed that Norman had murdered his mother and her boyfriend years before. And in order to keep the mother alive in his own mind, he dresses in her clothes, he speaks in her voice so he can have conversations with himself. The whole time you're hearing them argue, it's actually just one person arguing with himself. Basically, his personality has split right down the middle. And in his mind, his mother is just as possessive of him as he was of her. So whenever a woman comes into the situation and Norman is attracted to the woman, that triggers this homicidal mother personality. And then he dresses up, gets a knife, and in a fugue state, which he does not remember later, murders whoever the person is that is threatening their life together in solitude. Fascinating, fascinating psychology of a character that is further explored in all of the movies. There were 4 movies that Anthony Perkins starred in. The second one was made a couple years after Hitchcock's death. So there was a huge gap there in which Perkins went off and did other movies. Hitchcock did other movies. Hitchcock never really did sequels to his own material. He remade his own movie before, like The Man Who Wasn't There, or not The Man Who Wasn't There, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Mm-hmm. He remade that actually twice, I believe. He really liked that story. but he never did a sequel himself to Psycho. Years later, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, what do you think he would have thought about them? I mean, because if he was alive, if he, or do you think that they did it because he had already passed?
I think maybe they did it because he had already passed. I know that his family was they were okay with it. They had no problems with the films, any of the films. They never even had a problem with the remake that they did, Gus Van Sant's remake. And the people who did Psycho 2 had great admiration for Hitchcock's original film, and they did want to do justice to it. Mm-hmm. I mean, both the director, Richard Franklin, and Tom Holland, the screenwriter, who would later go on to write and direct movies like Child's Play and Fright Night. They wanted to do the best that they could with a sequel. And I think that, Psycho 2 is not my favorite of the sequels. Yeah. Anthony Perkins at first was not really interested in coming back to play Norman, because it's worth noting, I guess, that, like we said before, he was poised to be a leading man, the next James Dean, and then after Psycho,
that was it.
Unfortunately, he just could never really break the Norman Bates thing. And at first, I don't think he was all that adamant about doing the movie. For one, it was originally proposed as a made-for-TV movie. And though it was eventually released theatrically, I'll be honest with you, Psycho 2 has always had a little bit of a made-for-TV feel.
I was going to say that, actually, when you brought it up, that it always seemed like an 80s made-for-TV.
Yeah, it seemed like something you would watch on a Saturday afternoon. It's just like, it's, kind of slow, and it has that sort of TV movie pacing to it. You expect for there to be commercials interrupting.
Yeah.
They certainly didn't skimp on the violence. And maybe that's something we could talk about for just a second. Psycho, of course, was the proto-slasher film. Mm-hmm. A lot of what you think of as slashers now originated with that first Hitchcock movie. Mm-hmm. I think when you got to Psycho 2, which came out in 1983, during the slasher craze. Friday the 13th had already come out. Obviously, Halloween had already come out. In some ways, I think Psycho 2 is like a big budget studio slasher. And it has certain slasher tropes, and the violence in it is far more like a slasher film kind of vibe. I mean, Vera Miles returned. She was in the original playing Lila. She returned in Psycho 2 along with Anthony Perkins. Her death scene is like something you would see in Friday the 13th. She screams, knife comes down, goes into her mouth, goes out the back of her head. And then you see her there trying to get the knife out of her mouth as she falls over. It's very much a slasher type death. Dennis Franz, also long before he showed his ass on television, he got killed by someone in a dress in Psycho 2, which we'll go into that plot element as well here in a second. But again, slasher type death. What do you think? Do you think that Psycho... Do you think it was too much of an 80s slasher formula?
I felt so when I saw it. I thought, yeah.
You kind of lose a little. You lose a little bit of the class.
Yeah, the class and just the vibe of the first one. Just that. Because Hitchcock always had this thing of leave it to the person's imagination because their minds are probably sicker than yours and can come up with so much more than you can. And I kind of like that a little more. And just, I don't know. The first one just had a vibe, this whole vibe through it. And the second one was just like your typical 80s slasher movie.
Yeah.
It didn't really set apart. Does that make sense? It wasn't innovative. It was just.
Right. There's really nothing particularly innovative about 2, the way that the first one was so innovative, spawned an entire sort of genre or subgenre of slasher. It had a great cast, like I was saying before. Vera Miles, Dennis Franz, Robert Loggia played the psychiatrist who is kind of monitoring Norman, and Meg Tilly played Mary Samuels, who we eventually discover is Marion Crane's niece. She's Lila's daughter. And the plot of the movie is that Lila completely disagrees with Norman being released from the institution for obvious reasons, even though it's been 22 years later. I love how Anthony Perkins says that. They're like, you were in the asylum for 20 years. And he's like, 22. But he gets out of the asylum after 22 years. And Lila's like, hell no, he murdered my sister. So they go about trying to make him think that his mother is still around. Drive him crazy again is the idea. Mary has second thoughts and starts to fall for Norman. That's the Meg Tilly character. So she's sort of Norman's love interest in this particular film. There was a lot of talk on the set, though, of Anthony Perkins not liking Meg Tilly, because apparently at one point Meg Tilly made the remark, why is everyone so obsessed with Tony coming back for this movie? And he heard that. And when he heard that, the claws came out, let me tell you. And he was cold as ice to Meg Tilly for the rest of that picture on the set. Doesn't really show. I mean, they have their chemistry is fine in the movie. She's obviously younger than him, but I mean, Norman likes younger women. What can I say? And so I think she's really good in the movie as the female lead. I would like to hear Anthony Perkins' opinion on her performance. I don't know. Maybe he liked it ultimately himself. The question kind of became with scoring it that how do we match Bernard Herrmann's score? I mean, do we reference it? Do we do a Bernard Herrmann type thing? Eventually, they decided not to. So there's no Bernard Herrmann, screeching violins going on. It's Jerry Goldsmith's score. Jerry Goldsmith is a great composer who did great music. He is the composer of the Star Trek theme after the motion picture. He composed it for that, and they kept it for future stuff. I'm not a huge fan of his score for Psycho 2. It's just not my cup of tea. Maybe it's hard to follow Herrmann. How do you do that? one way or another, this movie was an enormous success. I mean, it definitely did what it claimed to do. It brought it back into the public eye in a big way. You know, it made $34 million on a $5 million budget, which for 83 ain't nothing to scoff at. Now, we got to roll back round to the movie I started talking about back when the show began. Psycho 3 is my favorite of the sequels. Psycho, you have to set it it's in a class of its own.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really compare 1960 Psycho to any of the sequels.
No, you can't.
It's just, but if you take the three sequels and you compare them to each other, in my opinion, Psycho 3 is the best. Yes, it does definitely fall into horror film tropes, or slasher film tropes, I should say more specifically. But it has this amazing giallo type feeling in the wild lighting and the eccentric ways that things are staged. The murders, for instance, are staged. And it was directed by Anthony Perkins himself. And I don't love it just because I'm a Perkins fan. I think to have never directed a film before, this movie has such a stylistic signature. There's nothing about it. You know how I was saying part 2 had a sort of made-for-TV feeling?
Mm-hmm.
There was a sense of set the camera up. And I'm not saying anything against Richard Franklin. He's a fine director. But in my opinion, there is nothing extraordinary about the way Psycho 2 is shot for it. Psycho 3 has an extraordinarily eccentric, weird visual style. And I really love it. The lighting is moody. The transitions are very odd. Like I remember there are weird moments in it that, like, where the character Jeff Fahey plays, he's Dwayne Duke, but, friends just call me Duke. He's a drifter. It comes to the Bates Motel and winds up working there. That doesn't end well. But he goes to a bar and he meets Tracy Venable, who is played by Roberta Maxwell, and she's researching the Bates case. She's writing a story on it. And he looks up at the TV, and there's like this scene where you see what looks like a boat capsizing and rough waters, and people are screaming. And then from that TV shot, you pan over and you realize we've transitioned into the parlor of the Bates Motel, and Norman is in there. So number one, that's a really cool transition from one scene into another. But then something really interesting happens, because a young woman named Maureen Coyle, who is played by Diana Scarwood, a former nun who has many, many psychological problems, is staying in cabin 1 of the Bates Motel. So Norman gets up and he walks to the TV and switches it off. But all the screaming going on the TV, some of it you can still hear. And it appears to be coming from the cabin number 1. And then Norman walks over. And it's almost as if Norman, being psychologically disturbed himself, is sensing this disturbance in Maureen's head. And when those screams, which are not actually there, sort of are representing Maureen's inner turmoil. It's a fascinating bit of directing. And I really love that particular scene amongst many others in this film. Written by Charles Edward Pogue, who we mentioned on our show about The Fly, because very same year he co-wrote The Fly with David Cronenberg. It's a big year for Charles Edward Pogue, but he wrote this movie. And there are a lot of things. I mean, like where the car plunges underwater. That's a really creepy scene. There are many, many musical accents to this movie that make it all the more creepy, with this strange, like, chanting score, where it's almost maybe because the Maureen character is, a fallen nun. If you've seen the movie, no pun intended there, but But there's this sort of strange chanting that's going on the score, which is done by whom? One of my all-time favorite composers. You know who it is, Carter Burwell. He does a tremendous score for Psycho 3. And I am a huge fan of him in general. I am in awe of Carter Burwell. I've always said that if I could ever afford Carter Burwell, he would score a film that because I think he's one of the greats. And again, underrated, like Perkins.
I remember when I don't know if I should even bring this movie up, but Twilight, you were like, I like the score.
You're right. We watched the movie, and you asked me, and I was like, well, that score is great. Carter Burwell, man.
And then I said, I hate that main girl. And then you're like, of course you do, because you hated her in Panic Room.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think you didn't even know that was the same girl.
No, I didn't. I just I think we rented it or something, and we watched it. And you were like, I love the score, and I was like, I hate that girl.
So that was our assessment of the Twilight movie. But yeah, Carter Burwell did a great score for that as well. He's a hell of a composer. As Jerry Goldsmith, I've stopped saying film composer because I can hear the spirit of Jerry Goldsmith, rest his soul, in my ear, saying, we're not film composers, we're composers. Because he was big on that. He was like, well, you're not, there's no such thing as a film composer. You're either a composer or you're not. So I've since stopped saying film composer because he's right. If you're a composer of music, you compose music. But anyway, yeah, so there's an interesting stuff. There's some callbacks in Psycho 3 to the original with, Maureen ultimately meets her end by falling down the stairs like Arbogast, only unlike him, she gets a cherubic arrow in the back of her head. There's a great bit where Tracy comes into the house and turns around and there's Norman and he's doing this like this face thing that's great. And he's like, why can't you leave my poor son, my Norman, alone? It's like, that's a wonderful shot. Sometimes it might make you chuckle a little bit, but it's pretty creepy in and of itself. Great bit of directing and acting by Anthony Perkins. That movie was not a huge success, sadly. Again, kind of underrated, a cult sort of gem. The ending was meant to set up more with Norman, but didn't really go down the path that Anthony Perkins was thinking it would, because him and Charles Edward Pogue were talking about what a fourth film might be if Psycho 3 was a success. I want to throw in a little bit about the mythology that was, I'm going to use an awful word, retconned in Psycho 2 and 3. What you find out in those movies is that in Psycho 2, really the murderer in that movie is not Norman Bates. Norman is sane throughout the majority of Psycho 2. The murderer in that movie is an older lady who works with him at a diner nearby where he has a part-time job in the kitchen, a woman named Emma Spool. And according to Emma Spool, Norman is really her son. And the person he thought was his mother was her sister, and she raised him. So at the end of Psycho 2, Norman, thinking he's found his true mother, having been now driven insane again, kills Emma Spool, stuffs her like he did Norma Bates, and puts her up in the room. And then in Psycho 3, she's the body up in the bedroom. But what you learn in Psycho 3 is that Emma Spool was just insane, and that everything that she told Norman was a lie. The person that he thought was his mother originally was his mother, and that Emma apparently had tried to kidnap him when he was a baby from her sister and wound up in an asylum, and she's been insane all of her life, thinking that Norman was really her son when he wasn't. So it was this sort of, like I say, retcon of the original film that is turned back around at the end, and you realize that no, Emma Spool wasn't the mother. This was all a lie, So it doesn't really change anything after part 3. I mean, Norman's mother was who we always thought she was. So that kind of leads into part 4, which was made years after 3. Joe Stefano, the original screenwriter, came back. He decided it wasn't like you do now where you reboot something and you say none of the other stuff actually happened. But because Stefano's script does acknowledge at one point that there were murders between Psycho 1 and 4. Mm-hmm. But kind of the way Stefano approached it was just don't acknowledge them too much. We'll just do one passing reference. But basically what Stefano wanted to do was write a sequel to the original Psycho with part 4. Mick Garris directed it, who went on to do many Stephen King adaptations and be a horror director, in his own right. And part 4 is really, really interesting. It was made for cable, not network TV. It was made for Showtime.
Yeah, I remember that one when it, the ads.
I could not wait to see it. Being the Psycho fanatic that I was, being psycho about Psycho. Norman, after only a few years, you have to kind of buy the conceit of this in order to enjoy the movie. You have to believe that after like 4 or 5 years, Norman has been released yet again from the asylum.
You think they would just give up at this point?
Yeah. Like in actual fact, of course, Norman would never be released after the awful things that he did in part 2 and 3. Really in part 3, because Emma Spool did all the shit in part 2. But other than her own murder. But anyway, Norman is now free in the custody of his psychiatrist, who incidentally is also his wife. So Norman has a way with the ladies. Even though he's killed many of them, they always seem to, he always seems to seduce them. But hey, maybe it's because the actual Norman personality, it's like Anthony Perkins used to say when they asked him what he thought about Norman Bates as a character. And Anthony Perkins used to say that there was a part of him that really admired Norman Bates because he felt that Norman always just tried to do the best he could with what he had. And he thought that was an admirable trait. And I kind of see what he's saying there, because the actual Norman persona is sort of this arrested development teenager. There's an innocence to him. Mm-hmm. I'm glad they didn't include like Norman reading porn and stuff in the original movie, because, when Lila goes into his room, she finds like childish things in his room. Like things that a man in his late 20s, early 30s probably wouldn't have, and it suggests that Norman is mentally trapped to some degree in that time period when he murdered his mother and just never quite got past that. And he's charming in that way, sort of like, there's lines that are so kind of sweet, like in Psycho 2, where he's talking to Robert Loggia, and he's talking about the guy that Dennis Franz's character, and he said Dennis Franz was trying to turn this into an adult motel. He says adult in the way a kid would. It's very, there's a sweetness to Norman that I think makes him far more endearing to an audience than if he was the Robert Bloch version.
And that probably also helped with with what the studios were afraid of with the book. The trashy, comments that they made. Yeah,
kind of like the dirty drunkard guy who's, jacking off to the patron. Yeah. If that had been the way they did Norman, I don't think you would have had an enduring character.
Yeah.
Because there's not much to relate to there,
And
but
then also
Norman,
the shock of finding out who the killer really is wouldn't have been.
Be lost. Yeah. You would just go, of course.
Yeah.
I do want to point out that, as many of you who have watched the show know, I am a great admirer of the slasher film Black Christmas. Olivia Hussey, one of the stars of Black Christmas, played Norma Bates in flashbacks, because basically what Psycho 3 is, or what Psycho 4 is it's a sequel and a prequel. It's a sequel in so much as you see what's happening with Norman now. You find out that he's married to a psychiatrist and that she is pregnant. And this has set Norman off because he is afraid that his kind of insanity is genetic, and he's thinking he's going to pass on his madness to the child that she's pregnant with. So Norman is considering whether or not he's going to murder his wife. And
Olivia Hussey.
Yeah,
Juliet,
well, not. Yeah.
Jesus's mom.
Yeah.
Sorry.
She but the wife isn't Olivia Hussey.
Yeah,
Olivia,
no, he's his mother. Yeah.
But as he says in the movie, he's not murdering his wife because he is being possessed by his mother. He's murdering the wife, as he said. This is the second time he's doing it by his own hand. So he's murdering her because he's Norman and he thinks his child is going to be crazy. So it's a different kind of take on Norman, because in a way he is sort of sane in this movie. Mm-hmm. He is not possessed by his mother, but in the flashback in the flashback sequences, you do see, him as a boy played by Henry Thompson, or Thomas rather, and Olivia Hussey as the mother. And you see how he came to be essentially the person that we met in the 1960 original film. There are some inconsistencies, but only real psycho fanatics would point them out or notice them. One in particular is in the original movie when Norman is talking, he refers to the building of the motel, and he said that his mother's boyfriend, the one that he murdered along with his mother, that the boyfriend was the person that convinced his mother to build the motel. What you find out in part 4 in the flashbacks is the motel's already there when he meets, when Norma meets the boyfriend. So there's some sort of inconsistency going on there. I don't know if it was just like, well, we need it to already be there, so we don't want to go into this whole story of them building a motel and everything for time reasons. But there is sort of minor story inconsistencies. I'm willing to overlook that because the movie is by and large, it's pretty good. I don't mind that movie at all. I thought that Henry Thomas of E.T. fame did a fine job playing young Norman Bates. I do know that Mick Garris, the director, has said since that he found Anthony Perkins to be somewhat difficult to work with. Mick Garris was not a seasoned director at the time, and he used to say that Perkins was one of the most challenging actors he'd ever worked with because he said that Anthony always kind of pushed for answers, and he would do it in front of other people with him, and and you had to know that you were doing what you were doing. And one of the things Perkins was really big about, apparently, was saying, are you doing this shot because it's going to look good, or are you doing it because it's what's best for the story? And if Mick Garris couldn't say why it was best for the story and how it wasn't just an aesthetic choice, Perkins would, basically say, well, let's rethink it. So as a young director, Mick Garris kind of went through his rite of passage, it sounds like, with Anthony Perkins on this movie. Ultimately, it paid off because Garris said that Perkins really, really enjoyed how the movie came out. And I think, I remember watching it on Showtime and when it aired in 1990 and loving it. I mean, there is a good cast. CCH Pounder, which is a fantastic actress who I admire very, very much, was in it. The wife was played by Donna Mitchell, who was a good actress. And CCH Pounder plays a radio host, by the way, who Norman is calling into. A lot of the story is sort of predicated on Norman talking to this radio show host and telling his life story, which is how we facilitate all the flashback material. Sort of a sad note, though, it was during the filming of Psycho 4 that Anthony Perkins was diagnosed with HIV. Which he had apparently contracted earlier, possibly around the time of Psycho 3, but did not realize he had it until several years later. And this eventually led to his death a couple years later, on September 12th of 1992, 2 years after this was released in 1990. So that was very kind of sad for me, being, like I said, a great admirer of Anthony Perkins as an actor. I kind of would love to have known how Perkins might have come back in the 90s, because he was relegated at the time of his death to a lot of TV movies and a lot of movies like, Edge of Sanity and In the Dark Woods. And you just go in the deep, dark woods, and you just look at it and you go, an actor of his caliber really deserves a little bit better than some of this material. I would love to have seen if Perkins had lived like a couple more years at least, and you got into the 90s revolution of Tarantino.
I was going to say Tarantino would if you used him.
Yeah, yeah. I would have loved to have seen, because I think he could have gotten some really great roles later, being from the generation of actors that he was from, which is, James Dean, Dennis Hopper. I mean, that sort of level of acting. Marlon Brando, he was of that era. And I think he could have, once you kind of got out of movies being sort of bland and stale and not challenging, into the era in the 90s when things started to get really perked up again creatively. I think he was actually in consideration and was going to work on that movie. What was it? Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. But unfortunately he passed away before that was filmed, and he was replaced by Terrence Stamp in the film. But that would have been perhaps the start of that sort of thing, Like I said, remake followed in 1998, done by Gus Van Sant, with Vince Vaughn, terribly miscast, as Norman Bates. I think maybe Jeremy Davies or somebody like that would have been a far better casting choice for Norman. I think Vince Vaughn is a little bit too much of a linebacker to be. He's a little too intimidating looking. And then, many, many years after that, for 5 seasons, from 2013 to 2017, Freddie Highmore played Norman Bates in the A&E show Bates Motel, with Vera Farmiga playing Norma. That is a show unto itself, because I watched the show and for the most part enjoyed it. I have my own kind of critiques about it, but I think we've kind of run out of time this week. So perhaps we'll dive into Bates Motel and maybe even the Gus Van Sant remake on a later show. But I hope you enjoyed this show about the Anthony Perkins Psycho film series. I know I certainly enjoyed it. This has been a long time coming. It's amazing we've been going this long with this show and have not mentioned Psycho. And I'm sure we'll probably do some more Alfred Hitchcock type shows soon, because we haven't really gone into Hitchcock in any great way other than this either. It just goes to show how many things there are actually to talk about out there. You never really run out of topics, but we have run out of time today. So thank you, Rebecca. And I want to thank all of you guys for joining us. Until next week, make sure to take care of yourselves.